This is Duke University.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to tonight's event. My name is Erdağ Göknar, and I am the director of the Duke University Middle East Studies Center. It's a personal and professional honor for me to introduce tonight's speaker, Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk. The National Museum is a perfect setting for tonight's event, as Pamuk's work embraces the idea of the novelist as archivist and curator. Since winning the Nobel Award in 2006, Pamuk's work has continued to push the boundaries of literary form and content. The cluster of works he produced around the Museum of Innocence alone, a novel in 2009, a museum and a museum catalog in 2012, as well as a film in 2015, is a characteristic example of Pamuk's blurring of traditional genre boundaries and his radical intertextuality. Of the project, Pamuk writes, "I was thinking of a museum as I was writing the novel. I thought that in each page, the story should be in touch with some objects that are evocative and attached to the story. One example of this is the old quince grinder, which was my way of evoking the 1980 military coup. The protagonist happens to be carrying a quince grinder, which soldiers mistake for a weapon. The grinder negotiates, as it were, between private, everyday family routine and the public military power of the state. In any case," Pamuk continues, "if you put the museum objects in order, they tell a larger story, one which constitutes the novel." The refusal to remain within one literary genre or cultural idiom has marked Pamuk's 9 novels. His work brings together narrative strains such as Ottoman Turkish history, the confines of identity, doubleness, excavations of the city, conspiracy, Islamic art, Sufism, the power of the Middle Eastern nation state, the coup, obsession, mystical love, the archive, collecting, lament, and the Istanbul melancholy known as hüzün. All of these strains are orchestrated through the city of Istanbul, Pamuk explains, a space that has become the memory of his fiction. It is perhaps not surprising that for someone who has a great love for walking through the deserted city streets at night, that the ideal protagonist would be one who does the same, a street vendor, a seller of boza. In A Strangeness in My Mind, Pamuk's version of the flaneur is an Anatolian migrant to the city, whose strangeness is the alienation and displacement of a rural migrant who enters the city for the first time. The strangeness of being in a scene, yet seeing oneself from the outside. An uncanny narrative double vision in which the familiar is defamiliarized and made new. The novel is unusual in other ways, though it pulls from some characteristic Pamuk techniques, such as the first to third person point of view switch, the multiple first person narrators, the humor and irony. It's not a typical Pamuk novel. That is, it shifts Pamuk's narrative repertoire, as most of his novels do, this time into social history. The 3-generational structure used here hasn't been used in a Pamuk novel since his first one, Cevdet Bey and Sons. A Strangeness in My Mind is not an ironic tale, but it is a realist one, and even ethnographic. As with any ethnography, it is predicated on fieldwork. It is a class-conscious novel. It tells the rise not of the bourgeois secular elite, as in Cevdet Bey, but of a newly enfranchised Muslim middle class. For people who were surprised about the outcome of the November 1st elections in Turkey, A Strangeness in My Mind provides some revealing insights. These are the neighborhoods and characters who make up the base of Erdogan's AKP, who was just won another parliamentary majority. That is, the novel offers both literary innovation as well as political revelations. Please join me in welcoming the curator of novels, Orhan Pamuk.
So pleased and honored to be here. I was here in 2003. Such a delight. I'm happy to see that the university is flourishing, and Erdağ is also very happy here. Please continue to make him happy. So, how to go into a novel that took 6 years to write, that covers a lot of social history, one private individual's novel based on a private individual's novel. Now, after this, please close the doors because I am also fussy and distracted. This is the story of one private individual. I started this as a short novel about a street vendor who loses his job. My intention was, for example, to write about a street vendor because of technological change or because of modernity loses his job. In my childhood, in 1950s and 60s, in the streets of Istanbul, yogurt, for example, was not a bottled product. Then I remember the first ceramic cups, then came glass cups, then glasses, and then cartoon yogurt boxes, then plastics, so forth and so on. These little details, this book focuses on these little details, but they are very suggestive. When you write about, say, glass yogurt cups, then it's also related to boxes, big trucks, traffic, distribution, advertisement, even one single little detail about our lives or daily lives about enjoying yogurt changes. It has so much consequences. Let's call them little micro-histories. This book is a sea of micro-histories. Yes, it also is ambitious and it wants to chronicle the change in Istanbul life seen through the point of view of lower classes, dispossessed people who immigrated to the city from poor Anatolian villages. When I was born in Istanbul in 1952, it was a city of 1 million. When this book opens in 1969, it was a city of 2.5 million. Now they say it's 15 or 16 million. This novel, in many ways, chronicles this development change where the unregistered, the government land is appropriated by poor peasants who come from most poor parts of Anatolia, do various jobs in connection with local gangs, mafia, semi-political organizations, or organizations, local organizations who back immigration to Istanbul. All the yogurt sellers of Istanbul in 50s, 60s, 70s used to sell boza, a slightly fermented alcoholic beverage. If you drink 3 glasses of boza, it is equal to 1 glass of beer, and it was legitimate most of the time in Ottoman Empire, while some Ottoman sultans used that it has alcohol, and the pious religious Ottoman sultans in disguise would go out at night and close, or spot and close the wine shops and boza shops. Thus, they knew this was alcoholic. There is alcohol in boza, while others did not care, thus paving way, making it easy for me to dramatize subjects such as what is identity? Is it based on religion? Because Islam forbids use of alcohol, or is it based on past, so forth and so on. The novel covers all this distance, but I started as a modest short book, a novella about a street vendor who loses his job. But once I begin to quote research, and I will come to what a research is for this book, then I begin to see that it's deeply intertwined with the stories of people who came to Istanbul penniless almost, but with some connections, build their own shanty houses, gecekondu in Turkish, with their own hands and tried to get government papers, decrees, whatever you call them, tapu in Turkish, so that will make legitimize their appropriating the land. Now, there are now 40-floor, 50-floor high-rises. I wouldn't call them skyscrapers, but in those places, and some of these people who came there in 1960s, even 50s now, just because they own this land and have the appropriate government paper, are rich. But in the end, this is like Anna Karenina, David Copperfield, a story of one person. I've been teaching a course, I've been teaching at Columbia University 1 semester a year. I'm a chaired professor, I'm happy to say. Essentially I'm teaching what we call, in a Henry James way, a bit with some pretension, art of the novel. And when we discuss books, I'm giving seminars, and when I occasionally say, and as you see, towards the end of the book, when Anna Karenina commits suicide, and we covered this book in 3 weeks, for example, some of the students say, "Oh, please, sir, don't tell us the ending," which upsets me, and I argue back. This is not a book club. This is a serious university. Also, implying that a novel is not its storyline. It's not a plot. There are so many theories why a character is developed, why a plot is developed. I strongly argue and passionately argue that a novel is, and these are the novels, that my kind of novel, is a galaxy of little details that the writer wants to talk about. A plot is a sort of a tree that holds all the leaves of these details. And then, of course, that tree has branches, that tree has a trunk. When I write a novel, when all of the novelists write a long novel, an epic novel, you cannot imagine the whole tree, say 40,000 leaves simultaneously at the beginning. But then you have an idea where it will go. I'm telling all this because a novel is a galaxy of focal points, interesting points that legitimizes and motivates the writer to write that story, to invent characters who would be appropriate and harmonious with that story. Plot does not matter. So, having said this, for 8 years, I decided in my next novel, which also took 6 years to write, I'll give the plot at the beginning. So, I'm going to read you the first paragraph of the novel. Thus, I'm saying that I'm so confident, maybe I'm naive about that, or about that this is, in the end, you would love the details, even if I give you the plot. Maybe I'm not giving, maybe I'm cheating. That you would perhaps enjoy it. This is the first paragraph of A Strangeness in My Mind. This is the story of life and daydreams of Mevlut Karataş, a seller of boza and yogurt. Born in 1957, 5 years younger than me, on the western edge of Asia, in a poor village overlooking a hazy lake in central Anatolia, he came to Istanbul at the age of 12, living there in the capital of the world for the rest of his life. When I first gave the first draft of the book to my publishers in Istanbul, and when they came up saying, me referring to Istanbul as in the capital of the world, they said, Orhan, slow down, calm down. And I insisted, and we kept it. When he was 25, he returned to the province of his birth, where he eloped with a village girl. This makes 200 pages. A rather strange affair that determined the rest of his days. Returning with her to Istanbul, he got married, 250, and had 2 daughters, 350. He took a number of jobs without pause, selling his yogurt, ice cream, and rice in the street and waiting tables. But every evening, without fail, he would wander the streets of Istanbul, selling boza and dreaming strange dreams. Yes.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. The novel's so rich, and there's so many entrees into the book. I wanted to start with something you alluded to, which was the process you go through when you're writing, and a novel like this requires a certain amount of field work. And so what is the process involved in preparing to write for you?
So once I decided that I will write a novel about a street vendor who loses a job, I also had an eye on boza because, as I pointed out, it is slightly alcoholic and it is perfect for triggering discussions about how Islamic is boza, while there is alcohol in it, that it was enjoyed by the Ottomans. What legitimized and what made boza going for 400 years was the fact that there is both alcohol in it and it is considered sometimes no alcohol in it. So if you want to enjoy with good conscience and also not worry about not being a good Muslim, there was boza. But once Kemal Atatürk's implementation of modern secular Turkish Republic, then you're not worried about enjoying alcohol because in modern Turkish Republic, alcohol was legal. So you would expect that selling boza at night or boza shops in Istanbul would immediately vanish after legitimization of alcohol for the Muslims too. But they did not. In 1930s, 40s, there were boza shops in Istanbul, and after 50s, 60s, 70s, there were, especially in the best times, in mid-70s, there were probably 2,000 boza street vendors who were selling boza, saying boza at nights in the streets of Istanbul. I have seen many times in my childhood, my grandmother in 1950s and 60s, hearing, say, at 10 o'clock, 10 p.m. at night, that a boza vendor is passing by with his romantic, melodious voice, selling this, and it would be children. There were many grandsons and daughters around who would want boza, and he would say, okay, open the window, say, bozacı, and then shout and bring us some, and would buy it. And the motivation, energy of the book is also related to my enchantment, with my encounter with this person who seemed not only as if he is coming from the poorest of Anatolian villages, but he seemed to be, he is coming from also Ottoman times. This is the romantic setting of boza, buying boza, enjoying boza, that it's ritual of inviting someone up to your apartment, flat, and buying something strange that is associated deeply with good old times. I'm not exaggerating. When you buy boza, most of the time you also buy, you're interested more in the ritual. And when I begin to write this novel, now that I'm answering your question, that I talked to many, not only street boza vendors, but street sellers, but 90% of the boza sellers knew that it's the ritual and romantic evocation of the Ottoman times, and perhaps the way middle classes, upper middle classes, pity the poor person, street vendor, who is walking in a cold night under the snow to make ends meet. These are what is at stake in a boza encounter. Boza. So you may ask me, how did you know that? Well, because I had a chat with boza sellers, but not only chat, but also organized interviews. I did interviews with boza sellers and many street vendors, or say retired policemen who was managing, overseeing main Beyoğlu Street in 70s, and 80s would tell me, because now I'm a well-known novelist, would be telling all the stories about the street life in Beirut. The book is heavily based on what is cultural studies professors would call oral history, and I did that. But then I did oral history in my own way. I have also friends cultural study anthropology students. One of them is actually doing a PhD. John Evren, if you are here, please raise your hand. I'm very happy to see you. So they also helped me getting information, getting details that you would not find in books. My novels are based, depending on the novel, are based on research somehow, a bit of research. Say, in order to write My Name is Red, I went to libraries, or most of the time, a reproduction of 16th, 17th, 15th century Ottoman and Persian manuscripts. Or in order to write Snow, I went to northern eastern town of Kars, where I stayed for a while and tried to get in touch with people and met people. So these things I refer to as research, work, whatever. I always enjoy these, and my research never stopped. In fact, when I had a 1-year research, only reading books and every day leaving home in between 1994 and 95, saying to my wife, today I'm going to start a novel and only read books. But I'm underlining this, the value of my books, this is the vanity of the author, is not based on this research, but the way my imagination converts this information into a novel, into a plot, into a story, into three-dimensional human beings. And then, of course, the challenge in this book was that the main character was lower class, while the writer is upper middle class intellectual, so to speak. But all novels, even if they portray lower classes, most novels, I would say, are written from the point of view of upper middle class intellectual. Best example for this perhaps be Anna Karenina, in the sense that there is this protagonist, the main character of that book, Levin, has a self-imposed agenda of getting to know the peasants. He goes out and to his village, visits the peasants, moves them together, just because he feels a bit guilty. A feeling of guilt is felt in all novels that is busy with portraying lower classes. I was also thinking how to render my protagonist, who comes to Istanbul almost penniless, who lives in a one-room house almost all of his life, because a traditional novel, Dickens novel, Emile Zola novel, or John Steinbeck novel, managed to deal with this kind of portrayal with a lot of melodrama, also tears, really. My energies and creative energies and motivation was to avoid that kind of melodrama and write a novel that takes place only through lower class characters. And in this book, there is no one middle class intellectual who feels guilty and worries about the well-being or terrible situation of the lower classes. And in fact, lower classes also do not consider themselves in a terrible situation. Perhaps the upper class mobility, perhaps the economical boom, especially in the last 2 decades we have witnessed in Turkey, helps my characters out. And a lot of effort went into making this novel humorous, so that to avoid, again, melodrama or making characters tear-jerkers so that we are all crying for the poor guy. Poor guy does not feel himself to be a poor guy. In fact, I don't want to underline too much of the secret points of the novel. Maybe I should stop here. And So you're saying research? Yeah. Why did you come, Orhan? You're not a street vendor. How do you know these people? I talk to them. John Ebren and others help me, and also I have imagination. A novel is, of course, both getting lots of facts together, and if you're in Turkey, there are not enough books about these facts, the writer's imagination. You may get the factual details of a character, say, how does a street vendor cook his rice and chicken? Okay, you talk. Even you don't need a researcher. You eat one and say, wow, well done, how do you cook it? And then in 5 minutes he tells you how he cooks it, cooks it. And if you talk 5 minutes again, oh, well cooked. And he's proudly boasting how he cooked it. And after 10 minutes, I ask him again, what about your wife? He confesses that it's actually his wife who cooked it. But we'll come to these subjects because I also consider this my first feminist novel. Maybe you ask another question.
We'll come to the feminist novel part in a minute. But I really liked what you said about the Boza Seller coming out of the past, in a sense, the Ottoman past and what that represents. And that's interesting to think about. If you think about the Boza Seller actually at night calling out, it's sort of a haunting call, but there's a way in which it also resonates as a metonym with the Ottoman past, perhaps, the Islamic past, perhaps. And there's this one very interesting scene early on where the Boza Seller is called up to the very kind of secular, modern kind of party, and they want to have a kind of discussion with this person. It's slightly demeaning. They sort of, it's sort of demeaning. They're sort of talking down to him a little bit, and there's an interesting back and forth there that brings up the issue of politics, I think. And so the question has to do with the position of the Boza Seller and politics in the present, based on what that Boza Seller represents in the past.
Yes. Okay. There is a lot of politics in the book, but neither nor Mevlut is actually a political person. With that, I mean, we are not initially motivated by politics. I have found myself in political situations because I just react to political developments in Turkey. Mevlut has many political friends, but he's a street vendor who wants to survive, and he doesn't have strong political opinions. Mevlut has ultra right-wing nationalist friends, and also Alevi leftist, Alevi Turkish Shia leftist communist friends, and he also visits, I wouldn't say attends, to a sheikh of a dervish lodge in especially in late 90s, a sort of a modern dervish lodge. If he had strong political opinions and self-imposed moral constraints, he wouldn't be able to one day to talk with a friend, leftist friends, even write slogans on the wall, and the next day be friendly with a dervish, a sheikh of a dervish lodge. In fact, he is hiding this various activities, his connections with various groups in the city from each other. Characters with strong political and moral convictions in the novels cannot navigate from one corner of that society to the other. That's why Mevlut doesn't have strong opinions. But of course, readers will say, no, the other way around. Mevlut, you would think, I'm also being a bit transparent here. That's how novels are written. You don't have the character of the first Mevlut, and then let's see where he can go. Oh, he can go this place, he can go that place. First, I want a character who would take me to these places. Of course, the imagination and calculation of the writer of novels, operates simultaneously, both considering what this character can do for my story, what kind of details he can cover, also with what kind of landscape that I can cover with this character. These are the considerations that a novelist all the time makes these decisions fast and all the time.
Interesting. So the issue here about Istanbul is very important. The novel, in a sense, gives the background of the growth of Istanbul from a somewhat neglected city to really a global city. And from 1969 to 2012, you see an incredible amount of growth and change in the city. It's reflected in a very interesting way. All of your novels deal with Istanbul in very particular ways. And I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about the importance of the city to your work, but also the way there are different facets of Istanbul that emerge out of different novels. So the Istanbul of the Black Book will be different than the Istanbul of the Strangeness in my mind. What is the significance of the city?
Okay. The idea that I'm an Istanbul novelist came to me late. Actually, I did not have those ambitions. I just wanted to be a normal fiction writer, and fiction writers write about human beings they know best. I lived all my life in Istanbul, and I wanted to write about what I knew about humanity. And indirectly, since I came across humanity in Istanbul, and I was not aware of this at the beginning, my novels were all set in, most of them, in Istanbul. When my books begin to get translated and I begin to get some fame in mid-1990s, then internationally they begin to call me, oh, Istanbul writer. Not that I was not aware of it. In fact, I was aware of it because when I began writing and publishing my early books in 1970s in Turkey, the main body of Turkish fiction was dominated by the so-called peasant novelists. The best of them, one of the best of them is Yaşar Kemal. You may have heard about that they wrote tales about rural conditions in especially feudal parts of Turkey where landlords crushed the peasants and dispossessed, and also modern Turkish republics, utopian ideas about secularizing, modernizing, improving peasant life is also involved in the making of these novels. I had no connection to that kind of life. I was writing more about middle class, upper middle class, secular, westernized Istanbul bourgeois life in my novels. But what was the question? I'm sorry.
So the question was just the representation of Istanbul, really.
Okay. So I was aware that I'm a writer of Istanbul, and then after 1990s, I began to get self-conscious about that, and that made it at the beginning a bit harder because now that the random, casual way that I dealt with the town began to get to be a bit self-consciousness, and in fact, around that time, I began to think about writing my memoir, Istanbul, and I developed that book in a very self-imposed, self-conscious way. What is this city? What does a city mean to a person who is living there all his life? How do cities form our imagination and our identities? These were the energies that went into making of it. But then Istanbul is changing so fast in the last 2 decades. That I'm living in this town for the last 63 years, or now in the last 8 years also, spending 4 months in New York, that the change in Istanbul in the first 50 years of my life is less than the change that happened in the last 13, 12 years. This, I allude to immense economical growth. Everything is relative here. The rise of the high-rises, economical boom, change in daily life attitudes, and more change in the self-consciousness of the citizens of Istanbul, their mentality, the way they look at things, the way they eat things, the way they behave, think, read, imagine, dream, so forth and so on. The book is also about that. What happens if to us, if the city we are living in grows from 1 million to 15 million. I'm lucky to have witnessed that, and I feel very privileged and unique that luck had given me this privilege of witnessing that a city grow in my lifetime, in 63 years, from 1 million to 16 million. And not only that, I was inside the city all the time. And now that they told me, yes, I'm an Istanbul writer, I am now a self-conscious Istanbul writer, trying to catch up the growth and change, and it's getting harder and harder. In 70s, when there was a new bus stop or a new cinema, we'll all talk about that and go and have a visit, or a new neighborhood. In 50s, when a car passed in front of our house, my brother said, a car is coming. And look at it now. There are 17 million cars in Turkey, for example. All the numbers, if you read all the statistics, you're amazed. How am I going to catch up with it? Which makes the first 50 years of my life in Istanbul, I associated with hüzün, a sort of Turkish melancholy. Hüzün is an Arabic word, but I also try to develop its ethics and philosophy, what it means to live in a town where Turkish melancholy, hüzün, is the shared common sentiment. Its consequences, I argued, all that, a feeling of black and white, living at the edge of Europe, being poor, and in a way believing that this is a sort of a given fate, that it will never change, so forth and so on. These were the sentiments that I had, that went, and they were also shared by upper classes, middle classes, lower classes, and also Turkish film industry, Turkish music, Ottoman music, and modern Turkish poetry had a heavy stress on hüzün. So I put that in a frame and tried to explain the dominant feeling of the town till the day when I decided that I won't be neither an architect nor a painter, but I decided to be a novelist. And that is the end of my autobiography in 1973, which I published in 2003. And when I published it 30 years later, I wrote it in 2003 and published it. The young generation of Turkish writers already told me that, Mr. Pamuk, your book and your sense of Istanbul, black and white, poor and melancholic, is not the one we have. Our Istanbul is more colorful, more happy, more prosperous, and I agree with that. But I argued saying that cities don't have essential attributes except that of given by geography. Istanbul's character, if it has an eternal quality, its Bosphorus, the vitality, the breeze, the strength and geographical conditions that it lends to Istanbul, that is what it has for essential quality of the city. The melancholy, perhaps, as the young generations had noticed even in 2003 and 2004 and told to me, as they told me, that it's not melancholic city anymore, or perhaps as much as it seemed to me or to the other inhabitants of the city in early 60s. So I am saying all this verbiage because I want to underline that this book is not melancholic, not about black and white. There is no Ottoman hüzün in this. It is about the struggle of a street vendor who has immense imagination, perhaps similar to mine. His humanity, I gave 6 years to render his humanity fully. And in fact, I gave 6 years to identify with him fully. Perhaps, as I argued a bit, that novels, art of the novel, is not very keen in dramatizing the problems or humanity, interior world of a lower class character. We always need a middle class character to fully accomplish that. And I did this deliberately, but it was also a challenge to render the humanity of a lower class character, because if you lend him full humanity, the readers will never accept him as a lower class. And you know, I also wrote the novel in first person, third person singular, and that also caused some problems. But I'm telling all this to say that there is not one Istanbul, even in my novels, that there is the Istanbul that is still changing. I'm now finishing a short novel. It is really changing the way I write about it. It's now is a vibrant, hectic, anarchic, chaotic city that is changing and is also glamorously self-conscious about its change and happy and posing. It has high rises. When I came to New York in 1985, when there was a little mention of Turkey in a sixth page of a little in the New York Times, Turks in New York used to call each other. Now, there is almost once in 2 days, there's a big news about Turkey. And I began, Turks were introverted in 50s, 60s, 70s, while now Istanbul is happy advertising. You see, it's a touristic center. It's an entirely different city, while I'm the same person trying to catch up with it, trying to cover in new neighborhoods. I used to go to, when I was writing this novel with my girlfriend, we used to go to look at the map and let's go to this Gazi Mahallesi. Let's go to this and with my bodyguard behind, visit these places, read PhD theses written about these neighborhoods, so forth and so on. It was a joyous 6 years writing this novel, both researching, imagining, changing, writing, deleting, so forth and so on. But I should make it clear that this is not a nostalgic book about 1950s. This is a book about where Istanbul, that nostalgic perhaps, I don't even consider that book nostalgic, stops and this immense change begins. People, when my Istanbul autobiography ends in 1973, more or less my character Mevlut comes to Istanbul that time, and we here cover 40 different years, and they are entirely different than the mood of my autobiographical Istanbul.
So there's a way in which the trajectory of your work, you can feel the emotional tenor or the affect of the city change, especially, I mean, if we think about the kind of mood that is set up in the Black Book, and then after that you refer to My Name is Red as one of your most optimistic novels, there's a way in which this keder or melancholy or huzun is met with a kind of contentment that we see coming out in the other work. You've been known for writing novels that change form. Each time that you're experimenting with a new type of form, each time a new novel comes out. I want you to say a little bit about the trajectory of that change in form and how it reflects in this particular work.
When I was writing this novel, I'm happy to say that I have also seen that the youthful postmodern in me is still alive and kicking. One of the self-imposed constraints, and I do that a lot when I write a novel, is, for example, when I was writing Museum of Innocence, the constraint was pay attention to objects that I should exhibit in the museum, and never end the chapter without covering in detail a few objects, for example. Or when I was writing this novel, as I said, don't push a middle-class character's opinions to melodramatize the story. Or again, when I was writing, I said to myself, this time I'll write like Dickens, like Zola, or with the language that Flaubert invented. That is, a language that is close to the protagonist. Here, Mevlut Karataş, and it can be David Copperfield, it can be Madame Bovary. And what do we have in those novels common? That there is a narrative voice which is close to the protagonist, and the narrative voice uses that protagonist's lexicon. It's limited. Its point of view is limited to that character's culture, history, lexicon. And also, it can navigate between making objective statements about history. Well, we open Tolstoy, we say, as Napoleon's armies were approaching Moscow. Now, no character is speaking here. Tolstoy is speaking, but he's not saying Tolstoy is speaking. some narrative voice is speaking. Then it gets closer to Pierre, for example, a character in a novel, and he say his mood, say he's upset or is in love. So the narrative voice and the descriptive details sees what Pierre is interested in. So this is Flaubert's invention, so that without changing any, making it clear, the narrative voice in the story can get close to objective history and close to interiority of the spiritual lexicon of the character. I decided that I would write a novel like that in the manner of Zola, Dickens, so forth and so on. But as I was writing the book, I was not satisfied with what I had, perhaps because the strength and authenticity and sincerity of all the interviews that I did and my friends did, that the text I had, and my conversations with street vendors of Istanbul, not only street vendors, but as police, other guys, insurance people, electricity people, all sorts of mafia kind of people, taxi drivers, and I felt that I want to represent the convincing power of these monologues I had, or interviews. And so I begin to a little bit of an experiment. What if I insert inside, say, a third person singular of a Dickensian or Balzac or Emile Zola novel, first person singulars, which complement or sometimes argue or reject or tell stories that refuse what the main third person singular narrative voice is saying. That is something that I did also in My Name is Red, where first person singulars monologues are telling the story, as developed by William Faulkner in As I Lay Dying and Sound and Fury. I developed that slightly in My Name is Red to open a self-conscious fictional space where characters refer to each other, refer to main text. Obviously, they are aware of what the other characters say, so they are aware that they are in a fictive space, although it takes place in 16th century, lending me the opportunity to be a fully postmodern in the sense that my characters are aware of the fact that they are in a novel, while on the other hand, I'm very busy manipulating their monologues in such a way that will not make the novel read a bit artificial and fake. I developed this. I decided to develop what I initially implemented in My Name is Red in this novel, where a novel that unfolds like a 19th century Dickens novel, where suddenly characters that are mentioned begin to take the microphone and begin to talk and say, it's not like that actually, and then begin to negate each other, begin to be unreliable, and you begin to have suspect the truth content of their monologues. This also gave me opportunity to be a bit playful. Also, the continuous reliability, or I like his observation. The New Yorker critic James Wood once said they are reliable narrators or unreliable narrators, or reliably unreliable narrators, or, as I say, unreliably reliable narrators. And what is that? An ultra-nationalist guy who's saying what is a great thing that everything related to him. What a great religion we have. What a great this we have. And of course, the reader is, they are consistent, but are they truthful? We may ask, or the other way around. So, point of view and reliability of the characters also intertwined with the traditional 19th century text also went into making of this novel. In a way, I was again slightly experimental and postmodernish, but I'm not underlining it. I am just telling because Erdağ asked.
So there's a wonderful way that your work, when you look at it as a whole, sort of recapitulates a literary history, and it's actually delightful and rewarding to read your work, not just one novel, but but as a longer sort of project. I think that's very, very interesting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the very interesting details that emerge in this novel that are very fascinating. I mean, just things like, people going out and putting communist posters on. Is this not? I think we found the wonderful scene where you have these youths putting up communist posters on mosque walls. The idea that there's a woman Neriman out there that the main character follows. The wonderful, you have this a lot in your work. There are usually a lot of archival scenes, one way or another. The wonderful archive of the electric company, right? That tells its own history of the city. Are these things that you come across, and they're gems that you find, and you know immediately that this will be working very well in the plot of the novel? How does that unfold for you? The discovery of these details.
They're like all novelists, these details come to me. Which one do you want me to talk about? The electricity thing, it takes some 20 pages in the book. Or the other one, thank you for making a little selected list from the anecdotes, little episodes in the novel. They all come in various different ways. I may have a chat with the guy, or it's just, for example, the electricity thing that actually they wanted to do that to me. Then I said, why don't you come in and tell me another, because I like meeting people and talking and opening up. It's partly, I don't do it like a spy, but I do it like a writer. I also, after a while, honestly tell this, I'm not a journalist, actually I'm a novelist. And I also should tell that all these details, a novelist is a person who is open, whose tentacles should be open to all the wonders of life, paying attention to it, then taking notes, then remembering them, then thinking how I will integrate this detail, this story. For example, one day, an electricity guy came for bribe or threatening them. Then I learned so much scandalous details about electrical money, getting the money from subscribers. Then I go to other people, Istanbul, Turkish Electrical Institute, the Union of Electrical Supervisors, company managers, retired people. I love this. I love the research part of writing novels. And then if you say, how does this come to you? All novels, this or that way, details come to us.
So then, if we go to that interesting framing of intent or niyet and fate or qismet that emerges out of the novel, we'll talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Our character, Mevlut Karataş, writes love letters to a girl he sees in a wedding for 3 seconds. He sees from a distance her eyes, and everyone is saying that, wow, what a beautiful girl. So he also is not ever even sure what he saw, but writes love letters to her. Then the family is involved, and then they arrange that they both should run away together. But he elopes with her at night and to see that this is not the girl that he wrote the letters, or this is not the girl whose eyes he saw from a distance 3 years ago. I'm not giving the ending. This is the first 5 pages of the novel. In fact, more interesting story is how they make up, how good, the elegance of their friendship. These are the things that I care about. But then this paved way of a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of the logic that frames the story. Also, there is Islamic theology part to it. What counts in religion or in our beliefs, or in the day of judgment? Is it our intentions, or is it our deeds that would someday would be put on a pedestal, and the final judgment about us will be given? Most of the time, this subject pops up in various disguises in the book, such as In a repressed society, people, in order to survive, like my Mevlut, like many characters in the book, hide their opinions, political opinions, social opinions, and they say, when you ask them a question, they say, they give a silly answer just to avoid political confrontation. And when they ask, why do you do that? Well, this is my formal, social phase or saying. So the book chronicles this kind of distinction, which I attribute to oppressed societies where free speech, not only in public sphere, but also among citizens, is almost impossible. This book is not I'm not saying this as I am saying to you. Free speech in Turkey is only possible inside the family. And there is a lot of free speech in this book.
Excellent. I think that we'll have one more question, then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. But and maybe I'll give you. I don't know if you want to talk about this. You just let me know. But would you?
I'll let you know, Erdağ. Don't worry about that.
Would you be willing to talk a little bit about the novel that you're currently finishing?
Oh yeah, maybe I don't want you to know about that. Okay. It's not very good. It's not a good sign to give away what you're writing. But at least this time, I am sure that I will achieve it because it came to an end. You know, this novel, 600 pages, started as a short novella, a short novel, as a novella. As I say this, people laugh, but I also remind you that Ulysses by James Joyce started as a short story. But finally, I have achieved almost finishing a novel that is, well, in English translation will be 220 pages or something like that. I'm very happy that I'm achieving this and stopping the digressive mind that I have. I'm always legitimizing that my digressions or the way my novels tend to get long with this anecdote. Once upon a time, maybe 20 years ago, and I was a young novelist then, in the streets of Nişantaşı, the neighborhood, upper middle class neighborhood that I describe in my novels, in Black Book, in my first novel, Cevdet Bey, in Museum of Innocence that I describe in other novels as well. One day I was, as a young novelist, walking, and an elderly lady stopped me. I know who you are. I read all of your novels. I was happy. That's flattering, and I was smiling. And then she said, you don't know me. You know, novels, I read you, I know you. You don't know anything about me, which was okay. Then she said, are you writing a new one? Yes, I said, as I said to Erdağ. And she only said this, wrong advice maybe, make it long, she said, and went away. For this new novel that I'm finishing, and I will be hoping that I will be publishing only in 3 months in Turkey, it will be short. That's all I can say. So that's the main part. Maybe we take questions now.
Let's take some questions. Yeah. Miriam?
As I read Strangeness in my mind, and particularly the way you set it up so that, you know, it's almost like a play. So Samiha speaks and Raiha. And I was wondering if, for you, the novel is a very visual experience as you've been writing it. And is it in some ways going to be like the Innocence, the Museum of Innocence, that it's first a novel and, in fact, you see it as a film?
Oh, you're referring, there is this, maybe we have to tell. I mean, I understand your question as there was a Museum of Innocence, a novel, then a museum, and now will there be a film for this one? Or
well, I'm actually less interested in whether there's actually a film, but whether as you were writing this novel, you were actually seeing it, because it almost reads like a play.
I understand. Thank you. I take this as a compliment. All of my novels in my imagination are like films and plays. I am, perhaps I have to underline this, that consider myself a visual novelist. I wrote about this in my book, The Naive and Sentimental Novelist, that some novelists operate in our imagination through clearly defined images. We read Proust, Tolstoy, Nabokov are visual novelists. There's a memorable scene, but along with that scene, we remember some light, some color, some objects that the characters hold or engage with. I explore this subject, talk about it in an elegant way, summing it up and say that while there is no object, no color in Dostoevsky, and his scenes are even more memorable. I don't know why. Some novelists operate in our imagination through pictures, and in fact, that reading a novel is reading the words and sentences and paragraphs and continuously forming pictures in our mind's eye. When we read a novel, we simultaneously do 5, 6, 7 things at the same time, and one of them is, in the end, converting words to pictures. And in that, I argue that art of the novel is a very visual construct. That is, we try to evoke pictures in the reader's imagination through words. But first, in order to achieve that, the writer should have a picture in his or her mind first, then he converts that, he describes that picture in his imagination to words and puts in a book. Then someone else reads that book. He or she then tries to evoke the original picture the writer may have. But it's not the same thing. They never have the same picture. The reader and the writer will never have shared the same picture because there are words in between. And although we have shared memories, visual memories, when I say bus in Istanbul, my readers in Istanbul in the 1960s will remember one sort of bus, while in 1990s readers will imagine another sort of bus. Or when I write, Mevlut went into a bus, and if he enters into a bus in 1960, he enters from the front of the bus. And if he enters in 1970, he enters the bus from the behind the bus, because that must change for someone. This I'm saying that novels operate in readers' imagination because of a shared common experience. But once this shared common experience fades away, that is, so many centuries pass by, then novels will not communicate in the end. That is also the eternal limit of longevity of the novels too. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, did you try to fix that moment with Museum of Innocence when you put the image there? And so now that you share the image with your audience, the reader, now you're thinking about the same dress, right? Was that the intention? You wanted to put the image in front of us, and now we know what you were talking about in your novel.
I understand your question. Maybe I'll explain it. That I opened a museum. In 2008, I published a novel called Museum of Innocence, which is a love story that takes place in upper middle class character's infatuation with his twice removed cousin, who comes from the poor branch of the family. The novel chronicles a sort of character's infatuation with his twice removed cousin. That's the story. And in the museum, all the objects that characters in that novel touch, or all the pictures, films, that or visions they see, are exhibited in a museum. That was a conceit to publish the novel the day museum opened, the novel operating as a sort of an annotated museum catalog where there are no pictures and annotations are written and manipulated and put in a line in such a way that the annotated museum catalog reads like a novel. And in fact, I published the novel 4 years later, even and killed the postmodernist in me, formal postmodern, and it reads like an 19th century classical novel. But you're saying that when you put the object in the museum, was it that here's the object? I really did not think that way, but I understand your point. In the end, why did I open the museum of a novel? To that, I can now say there's a dead artist in me that I wanted to be a painter between the ages of 7 and 22. Perhaps that person, after I managed to implement myself as a novelist in Turkey, who wanted to enjoy a bit. And I also like the experimental quality of combining a novel with a museum. But am I saying that, here is the object, see the object, and the story is unfolding? Not necessarily, really. Yes, there is, and there are. My imagination first starts with images, and perhaps they are also related. But the enjoyment by the visitors of Museum of Innocence, the museum part, is not reading the book and looking at the object. I didn't know what will happen, but 60% of the visitors to the Museum of Innocence in Istanbul are not people that have read the book. Only 35-40% of the visitors, even and the number is going down. People just visit the museum because they find it interesting that there is a museum about a novel, although they have not read the novel. They always say that one day I will also read the novel, which is okay with me. Second, one person reads the novel, then he wants to see the museum. And of course, he doesn't want to see the museum. He also wants to come there with her husband, her wife, his wife, the children, friends. So one person reads a novel, brings along, I'm happy about that, 2 or 3 more visitors. The enjoyment of the museum and enjoyment of the novel are entirely different things. You don't need to read the novel to enjoy the museum. Museum is a sort of a place where you look at the objects and read the labels and enjoy the story a bit. It's also a modest city museum of Istanbul between 1950s and end of the 20th century. Maybe we get another question. Yes. Mm-hmm.
You said that things are changing more than ever, which is really interesting, for example, for my generation, because I was born in the 1990s, and growing up in that period, I feel like it's creating a different vision, different melancholy for my generation, and for us to understand the change in Turkey. And from that point, I don't want you to reveal your next book, but are you planning on writing a novel with a protagonist from our generation?
Oh, I see. Yes. As I get older, my characters, the age difference between me and as I get older, my characters are also getting older, but not as fast as I am. So the age difference with me and Mevlut Karataş is 5 years. Now, with the next novel, the age difference with the main character and me will be more than 10 years. As I get older, I'm breaking at least, I don't want my characters to be as old as I am as I get older. Don't tell this to anyone, by the way. Yes?
I want to ask something about the writing process. So when you start to write, do you have the whole book planned out, or there is some improvisation along the way?
This is one of the most frequently asked questions. Sometimes I want to crack a joke about it. Maybe I should do it. Yes, of course. Every sentence I know it before, and then there's one final day comes and I write it in 10 days. Just it's all in my head. Of course, it's impossible. In fact, human imagination and memory are closely linked. That if you know the limits of your memory, you also know the limits of your imagination, or the other way around. If you know the limits of your imagination, it's also, you remember that your memory is also like that. In the end, you cannot foresee a huge tree with, say, 3,000 or 30,000 fully developed leaves, while we may think about a novel in such a way. But yes, that tree has also a trunk and branches. But yes, at the beginning, you may have a sense of what the trunk be, some of the branches, and some after, not 30,000, but 1,000 leaves may be also clear in your head. So if the novel is that wall behind me, you start here, you do the branch, and you fully develop some leaves. But you cannot. Human mind is impossible to think of this and one day started. Your imagination works as you write, and as you write, you delete. You do one corner of the painting, and then you do something symmetrical at the other corner. Then you turn it around a bit. Then the fact that you develop something helps your imagination move more forward. And once you gain more ground, then you change. Go on and on like this. Deleting, changing, improving, deleting, changing, improving. Sometimes money boots when you say, change everything. Then suddenly, no change, and you're stuck. What American culture calls writer's block. I never had it. But I understand it. And on, you continue like this. While some writers say, William Faulkner says, well, I had this idea of that book, and says, snap, like an idea like that. I agree with that because he refers to it, the initial picture, that he has a picture. Say a girl is running away from her family from the window. The beginning of, he said in a Paris interview, beginning of Sound and Fury was such, he claimed. But believe me, there was more James Joyce influence than that kind of story. A novel is a crossing point of so many motivations, so many influences, so many personal stories, so many intentions, so many programming, designing, editing, that it's impossible to sum it up as this is the day I thought of that. But journalists love it, and so the writers tell it, and some readers believe it.
Period that the novel covers saw the politicization in Turkey of the headscarf. Mm-hmm. And some of your characters, your female characters, wear headscarves, some don't, and you describe in some detail what exactly they wear. Did this require any special research?
No, I don't need to know research. That's the life I've lived all my life. I had conservative friends based, and some of the details of Anne Chai, say Willie Hall's monologues, those of who had read, is based on my conservative friend's home that I went to do homework with. And that conservative friend's father came from Rize to run a bakkal shop, a grocery shop. But then he was a successful developer, and then he had money. He came as a penniless grocery shop owner. It's contradictory, penniless and not grocery shop owner. And he came almost a penniless guy, and then in 40 years he had a Mercedes, and his son was in my school, and then they were living a very conservative life. His father going to mosque 5 times a day. This, I don't need to do research. The troubling thing there is, the reader of this book would pay attention to headscarf like you do, while the characters in the book never pay attention to its invisible thing because everyone is wearing that. So how to underline, how to say that these characters, okay, you should not say all the time in the book, she was wearing headscarf. Everyone, all the women in the book are wearing headscarves. But the book should not say it because it's like saying another person came, he had clothes. So what do I do? While the readers would be keen on this little detail. If I overdo it, then I am transgressing the world of the characters and writing the book for the readers. I'll give you another example about my novel Snow, about this kind of choice, which is damning. In the end, You have to write about them because the readers of this book are not Mevluts, and perhaps Mevluts would never read this book. While this is the slightly politically incorrect nature of this kind of novel. I have a colonizing attitude because of my subject. I am not one of them while I'm representing and writing a novel about them. But then I don't treat them as them, but as fully developed Mevlut, who has a lot of my characteristics too. The title of the book refers to Strangeness in my mind because in my childhood years, teenage years, all of my friends used to say, Orhan, you have a strange mind. And then one day I was reading William Wordsworth's poetry. A strange in my mind. One day I will write a book with that title. But I wrote that book 30 years later. The example in Snow about who are you writing this book for sets the language of the novel. I went to small city of Kars and lived there for a while, and also semi-transparent about my intentions. I said, I'm going to write a reportage about Kars, not a novel. I was slightly lying, not too much. But on the other hand, I was living and breathing the atmosphere of that it's not a very intensely political town too. But I was capturing and feeling the atmosphere of the town. And as I was doing, one thing was clear, that in Kars, no one referred to, say, a meeting point or a building as so-and-so street, 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. No, they would say, or Muhtar Pasha Avenue or Kemal Atatürk Avenue, where they cross, there is this shop. They would refer to Hassan's next to Hassan's shops, or next to Old Pine tree, or next to Crazy Woman's house, or whatever. Very personal, informal, non-governmental descriptions of addresses. And I also, in order to study cars, both Cars Drivers Union Association's Cars map, and in order to be a driver in Kars, you have to memorize. So I also memorized all the streets of Kars when I was writing, and then I went back to Istanbul, memorized that. Even that small city has a fully developed map for drivers. So, okay, and when I was in Kars, I would say, in the corner of Ahmet Muhtar Pasha and Kemal Atatürk Avenue, they look at me sheepishly, what's that? Oh, you say it's a shop. So, one is the formal language, and the other is people's language. So, when I was writing a novel, very dramatical choice. Which one should I write my novel? If I say, as the people of society, because you're now rendering daily conversation, right? Then, in the daily conversation, and that novel has also a little bit of a detective thriller kind of plot, should I refer to that corner in the people's way? But then the readers don't know about people's way. Then you have to explain what. So I decided that I would write about it in the driver's license association language, which no one in Kars knew about, and neither the readers of that book know about. But then readers of that book know how to refer to places by formal addresses. They will be too upset if I refer to Crazy Woman's house and this house. So also that lends a sort of a Cartesian logic. This I'm telling because in the end, middle classes that invented the art of the novel, that consumed the art of the novel, imposed the point of view to the novels, while I did my best to avoid that in this novel in my modest way, so to speak.
So we have room for maybe 2 more questions.
Can they ask 3?
Maybe 3.
You know, we watched the film a couple of nights ago, and there are many ideas about what you meant by innocence. What are we referring to? And I was kind of astounded. The way I imagine it is, Museum of Innocence is where objects are contained inside the building, and they're not conscious, they're innocent. Yet no object exists just as an object, because it's the dress fishing board, it's the cigarette butt that I smoked while waiting for fishing, that's where the whatever is not innocent
Very
is
good.
imbued with the
Very,
object.
a good explanation of my usage of innocence in that book. I also want to underline two things that went into the choice of that word. It is also about cult of virginity, and then if you're a virgin, you would take your innocent. Another thing is that I was also trying to explore the vanishing of class distinctions, especially in a repressed society where there was only one TV channel, as it was in the beginning of the book, and upper classes, say Kemal's mother, and lower classes, everyone, the whole town, watching the same TV show as they enjoyed their dinner every night, and making the same pointless or innocent conversation, just a little off-the-hook remarks or anything, watching TV, not very sophisticated and intelligent remarks as we have dinner and look at TV sheepishly. In fact, that innocence here, in that sense, I'm referring to culture as something beyond class. And Webster's dictionary define one of the definitions of innocence in Webster's dictionary is artlessness. So I also had that then in mind. Yes.
Do you ever see yourself writing a novel that is not set in Istanbul, Turkey?
Yes,
in
I
New York,
do
for
that.
instance?
My Snow is set 95%, although there are Istanbul pages and Germany pages, chapters in that. 90% of my Snow is set in outside of Istanbul.
Yeah, actually, I meant outside Turkey, like in New York, for instance.
My friends at Columbia University always say that, Orhan, are you going to write a novel about New York? And I always say, don't worry, I won't write a campus novel and make fun of you. Yes?
Could you comment on your experience working with different translators? And so I'm wondering.
He has one very good translator.
I like to express my ideas about the translators when they're not around. We are very sweet. We work together with Erdağ. I did with Erdağ what I still do with various translators. They first do the translation, first draft, then send it to me. Then I take a pencil and go over it with notes. What are these notes about? With Erdağ, this never happens. If sometimes some translator make my apple an orange. Erdağ's Turkish is like mine, no problem about that. But then there is the musicality, the length of the sentences, continuity. Sometimes rendering 3 letters in Turkish requires you write 4 words because Turkey has suffixes. And with a 1 letter, you can mean a lot. Sometimes I say, well, translating that little detail would not be too economical. And the translator is right to ask me that deleting that detail because it passes to English with too many words. Most of the time, we are busy with melody, music, construction of sentences. Then, of course, again, translator is, just like the writer, should be able to make fast decisions so that he continue or go ahead, because when you translate, you're also making continuous decisions about, shall I render this? Well, if I try to render this fully, then I have to do a bit more inventive, more word choice. It's about coming to terms with translator's choices, testing his decision, sometimes agreeing, sometimes not. And another thing that I did, that's the, Erdağ will also remember, is that's the most damning, my translator. I read the text, I mark, I want something, but I don't know what that is. I'm not satisfied with my poor English, what did with this sentence, but I want something more grand, something more ambitious, a better sentence. Of course, I can't write it, but I am forcing poor Erdağ or some poor other person. there should be something like this here. So I worked with the translator like this, in a very passionate way. There were times that we were crawling, getting crossed and this or that, but everything that is left of that experience is sweet, that if you work with the translator and engage, it's also love of text, that you love that text, you care about that text, and there are also occasions that say, in Turkish you write, he was reading Cumhuriyet, and this book takes in 1960s, that means it's a leftist newspaper. Would the American reader know that? No. So I said, why don't you add here leftist Cumhuriyet, because these are cultural details that only working with the translator helps you to render that detail. Sometimes it's necessary, sometimes we skip it. Yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know, I guess having been born in Istanbul and lived there for 25 years, I feel like this, the city is getting richer, happier, more chaotic, but at the same time, it's losing stuff. It's losing some of the culture, and people have melancholy and nostalgia about that. As a writer of Istanbul, how do you feel about that?
Maybe I'll put it this way. A common question I'm asked, are you nostalgic about Istanbul? Nostalgia by itself is not a bad thing. It can be a good thing, but the experience of nostalgia I have from upper middle classes and upper classes is politically bothers me. More or less, the nostalgia that I have seen from Nişantaşı aunts and relatives and bourgeois friends and my mother's friends and whatever I get, it has this political message. Wow, we were so happy when we were 1 million and we were all bourgeois in Istanbul, and all these peasants came and spoiled our city. I don't believe in that. I find this terribly wrong and repressive, and I find this observation a bit repressive and right-wingish. While, as by itself, I like the idea of nostalgia, because the person who is nostalgic is not happy with the present. But he'd better have a utopia rather than nostalgia. Free speech, democracy, they are good utopias, but the nostalgic Nişantaşı people don't believe in those utopias too.
Maybe just one more.
Well, they want to talk, Erdağ, what's wrong? Yes?
Two more.
Okay. Thanks. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
I didn't want to give away some of the secrets of your book, but since I have you here, I have to ask. I'm curious. What is it about this 20,000 sheep?
That's a fact. That's an event. That you can find in Turkish newspapers. Even the name of the boat is right. So if you Google that, you'll find and read. Also, Milliyet, Cumhuriyet, even Hürriyet, 3 major Turkish newspapers they open their archives. You just go to Hürriyet archive, Cumhuriyet archive, and see the dates, and that's something that happened.
When you just repeated again, I was thinking maybe you were trying to point a milestone, or
no, it's just something that happened, and also provoke that strangeness in Mevlut Karataş's imagination. Maybe the last question. Yeah.
earlier you mentioned that I didn't talk about how this was your first feminist
Would
novel.
you speak a bit louder?
Earlier you mentioned
Please sit down, it's finishing.
You mentioned you would talk about how this was your first feminist novel, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Okay, thank you for asking this. The anger of women who were pushed inside their houses is represented with enthusiasm in this book. How the way woman is suppressed, the way they do everything. As I said, the chicken vendor posing me as if he is cooking it and washing the dishes. Actually, his wife is doing everything, and he is only selling it in the streets, implying that women are locked is a metaphorical, are suppressed and put inside the houses I have seen, I don't need to do any interview to see, to know that. This is what I have seen all my life, in my family, in the families of conservative families, poor families. Women do all the work, and men, okay, get there. This attitude, how to put that in words. I don't want to put that in concepts. That I am happy to say that there are so many details of women's repression, but it's not that I'm also happy. At least I wanted to do that. They are not passive. They fight back. They check. They needle. They make fun of the men. They crack jokes. Their imagination is strong. And in this novel, there are three sisters who are continuously comparing notes about their unhappiness or about their husbands. My mother had an elderly sister and a younger sister, and they used to come together. Though they are not from the same cultural and economical class of Mevlut Karataş, but they used to get, I used to see my mother and my aunt very happy, cracking jokes, more happier when they were their husbands, even their children, in criticizing, needling, inventing, making alternative stories, laughing and laughing. The friendship of lower class women who are very angry in the book is based on my aunt sentimentally. And this also gives a little bit of a spoonful of what to be a novelist like. You see something in your family, then project it, combine it with a lot of other information. You have the sentiment from here, you have the information from there, and you render. And I'm happy that I did, and thank you for your question. I'm happy that I rendered and gave full voice to anger of the woman in this book. I will continue to do so.